So good afternoon to everyone. If you're like me and it is afternoon, or good morning in other cases. Let's see. I'm sorry, I don't know why this taskbar don't do this. Come on. All right. So is everyone able to see my screen with the nice stock photo of people that I don't know?
Yes.
Yep.
Great, great. Well, welcome to Writing Better Forms. This is part of the second set of workshops being held during RailsConf. So I hope that y'all have had a chance to attend any of that first set and have had a great time so far. My name is Rachel Green, as it says. Yes, like the Friends character, if you're wondering. I do get that quite a lot. So I'm excited to be able to present to you today about how we can write better forms. Just to do a quick intro of myself, like I said, my name is Rachel Green. I am a senior software engineer at Homebase, where we focus on making it easier for small businesses to manage hourly workers so they can focus on the work that they like to do, right? So if you run a yoga business, you don't want to focus on paperwork and all that, right? You just want to teach yoga. So that's what we like to do at Homebase, is make sure that people can focus on the work they want to do rather than all the minutia of trying to manage schedules and everything like that. We are a Ruby on Rails shop at Homebase, and I have experience with Ruby and Ruby on Rails, even beyond that, with other roles at like a consulting firm and startup and things like that. I have experience with JavaScript, particularly with React, as well as a bit of Node and Express. I also have experience with Erlang and OTP, some experience with Python, because I feel like, of course, everyone at some point learns Python, right, for work, as well as just other languages and frameworks I've picked up over time. In my spare time, I do like to contribute to open source development. In particular, I am one of the maintainers for EBWiki. So EBWiki is a civic tech app, that also has a Ruby on Rails stack, where we focus on chronicling incidents where people of color are killed by police or due to police action here in the US. So we try to capture not only when these incidents occur, but also what happens afterwards. You know, what happens if there's an investigation by the corresponding law enforcement agency, or maybe some of the other agencies around the area, if there is a trial or a civil suit or anything like that, the community response, any policy changes by law enforcement agencies in response to the incident, so that we can hopefully put together a clearer picture of what the community and law enforcement deal with when these incidents occur. And when I am enforcing good habits and boundaries around screen time and making myself get away from my computer, I like to bake bread and read books. So before I get started, there are a few housekeeping rules. The first is that I highly recommend that you make code changes as you follow along. So I did have on the repo instructions for setting things up using both Docker, as well as if you just wanted to run anything locally. I do know that there were some issues with people in getting the Docker container to run correctly with the database host. I know when I looked into that, I got mixed feedback from some others that set that up again for me to do like a quick run through. So I know that there's at least one PR that has examples of some of the changes that you might need to make. But even if you don't necessarily run the code with me as we go along, I still suggest that, you know, you just type it out. And I've pasted everything so that way you'll have time to type it out, right? Like I'm typing out with you. You don't have to worry about me copy pasting something and you're trying to, type out 100 lines in 30 seconds. You don't have to worry about that. But I just highly recommend that you do that rather than just maybe making notes as we go along. I do ask that we stay muted unless you're speaking. You will have a chance to speak because there are times where I'll ask just general questions during the workshop. And also, if you have a question, please feel free to ask. We're on Zoom, so we have the raise hand reaction. If you're not familiar with it, it's in the reactions section. On Zoom, you can just press that to raise your hand. And every so often, I'll take a look, see if there's any hands raised, and be happy to answer your questions. Chat is disabled, so unfortunately, there's not really an option to be able to use that here. And then finally, if you do happen to fall behind during a section, don't worry, you'll be able to complete the changes later at your own pace. As Marty noted, this is being recorded, so you'll have access to the videos at a later date. Additionally, by the end of the month, what I'm going to do is I'll push a final version of our changes that we make today, along with slides of the different points that I'm making up to the repo, probably in like a separate branch. So you'll be able to see those as well. And so I'll actually stop there and ask, does anyone have any questions? I'll do a quick check to see if there are any raised hands. I'm not seeing any. Let me scroll just to be safe. Just to be on the safe side. All right, it looks like not. Okay. So with that, we'll get started. So I just wanted to briefly say, hey, why are we here? What's the point of this workshop? We talk about writing better forms, but what does that really mean? Well, I have found over the course of my career as a software developer that forms are a necessary evil, right? No one really likes forms, but we all need them. For most of the web apps that are out there, especially for Ruby on Rails apps, they're typically CRUD apps. So you're creating, reading, updating, deleting data. And two of those, the creating and updating, require a form usually. Usually the delete also requires a form, even if it's a bit hidden from the user. Sometimes you don't even have users until you get them to fill out a form, right? Because you have them sign up via a registration form or something like that to be able to get them to join your service. It's just necessary unless you want to write, countless import functions from a CSV or an API or web scraper. You're going to need to write a form at some point. But no one really likes them, right? From a developer side, it can be tricky. You'll get a mock-up from a designer and you'll be like, okay, I feel like I have to break HTML and CSS in order for this to work, right? Like this is just not possible given, what I know about the languages. You'll ask yourself, well, I'm trying to get this data, but the users can't, what they're submitting isn't in the right format for whatever system or person needs the data. And I'm constantly trying to do some type of data transformation on the end, secure all of this, and it just gets really messy. It's hard to maintain. And then on the user side, we don't like forms there either. We're like, why do we have to fill this out? Why is it so long? Why are there all these rules for some of the different inputs that I have to create? And then on top of that, half the time you don't even tell me that there's this rule for this input field until after I submit it, right? Like if you're gonna tell me my password has to be 12 characters long and include uppercase and lowercase letters, a number, and a special character, why can't I see that before I start typing instead of after I press submit? It just ends up being this kind of tug of war over a particular feature, really, of our apps that no one particularly cares for. But we all know that we need forms in order to be able to do some of whatever it is we're trying to accomplish with our web app. And so with this, I wanted to ask, how can we write better forms for developers and users? And so with that, I wanted us to imagine. I'm gonna in the slideshow here and then switch over to my particular copy of the repo, which you should be able to see here. So with that, I wanted us to imagine, well, let's say that we work as a developer at a company behind Campfire. The idea behind Campfire is that you have an app where you make it easy for users to create, join, and participate in different book clubs, right? So, you like to read, you want to join a book club, Campfire is the place to go. It's like a cooler version of Goodreads in some ways. You're a developer, you're new to the company, and your first ticket is to create a contact form for employees in publishing companies, right? So you're asked to create this contact form where an employee can say, hey, I work at Penguin. I work at Simon and Schuster. I work at whatever kind of publishing company that you could think of. And we're interested in working with Campfire to get our catalog imported into the app so that people can, look at our full list of books whenever they're choosing the next selection for their book club. And so they tell you, all right, such and such, we just need you to create a contact form where you need to get the publishers their name, their city and state, assuming they're in the United States, and then you need to get the contact person's information where it's their name, their email, and if possible their phone number, right? And once you get all of that information, then when they press submit, you'll shoot off an email that goes to some employee at your company. You don't know who, it's already been set up, but it'll send an email to that person saying, hey, you have another company that's interested. Here's the company info. Here's the contact info, next, be sure to add that to your list of things to do for next week or what have you. So quite a bit of that has already been set up in terms of the files, right? So if you looked at the repo, you would have seen that we already had like a publisher's model. With C data for that, we have the mailer already set up in terms of what emails should be sent to that particular employee. We have the routes set up, and then we also have our controllers set up. And so it's kind of like what you would expect as a developer, right? Where a good chunk of the files and things that you need are already there. Now, our job is just to kind of fill in the gaps. And in the process of doing that, to think about the different aspects of writing good forms in a way that makes it easy to maintain, as well as pleasing users when it comes time to fill those forms out. And I do want to stop and ask, are there any questions so far? Any raised hands?
I have something for Docker people. The entry point .sh, you may have trouble running it. You need to add execute permissions to the file.
Yes, thank you. I can't see who, it shifted away about who was speaking, but thank you for that. Thank you for noting that. I do appreciate that. All right. Are there any other questions, notes, comments? Just to be on the safe side? No? Okay. All right. So I always like to start in the controller. We don't need the routes file here, but it is there for you to see where we've set that up. But I always kind of like to start with the routes and the controller, where here we just have the new route where we're going to display the form, and then we have create, which will be the actual post action that we make when we submit the form. So we have our context controller here, and we have the new and create actions like you would expect. And then we have a private section that we'll add now. So it's important when we think about writing good forms to acknowledge the inherent security risks that comes with writing forms, that anytime you are taking in data from a potential end user, that you are opening up a security vector, right? Because you can't predict what the user is going to put there. And, you know, unfortunately, somebody malicious will might try to sneak something in there, either intentionally because they want to cause harm, or maybe just because they're bored and they want to see what their script can do, right? And so there's a number of ways that you can try to guard against those potential security risks when you're writing a form. Probably the most widely known for Rails developers is strong parameters, right? And that's what we're going to go ahead and cover in a second, right? Is adding those strong parameters. But even beyond that, there's other things that you can take advantage of within Rails to help deal with security issues. For example, if you're doing a server-side rendered app like we are here, with Rails, you get CSRF authenticity tokens, right? That whenever you have a form, it passes this token to the backend as part of the request so that it can verify, like, okay, yes, the same form that I rendered, that is that same, you know, browser window, it's all part of that same request and response cycle. I can verify this isn't just some random person, you know, hitting up this form. There's a number of other token mechanisms that people will use. For example, if you're looking at like more of an API style app on the Rails end, people use JWTs, JSON Web Tokens is probably the most common. Sometimes you'll see people do other types of tokens or secrets that are shared as part of session variables, or as part of, you know, headers in the authorization header in particular. It really just kind of depends on what the specifics of your particular application is. Even beyond that, there's other ways that you can secure your data, particularly in terms of data validation, right? So you can have server-side data validation as well as client-side data validation, where you're saying, all right, these are the things that a person can modify on this particular page. This is what can be part of the particular request in terms of the data. And then we can also validate that that data takes the shape and form that we expect it to, right? Even beyond that, you know, you might see different authorization strategies come into play. Probably the most popular authorization gems for Rails are Pundit and can. I always have to remember the third can, where, you know, you have policies or abilities depending on which gem you use, but those also can provide a way to secure whatever route you're using for your incoming data to ensure that, again, whoever is submitting data is who they say they are in cases where that matters, and also that they are allowed to do so. And like I said, there's different routes with data validation on the back end that you can have. Besides the strong parameters, you can do validation usually through active record and active model. Rails also provides the benefit of a lot of built-in sanitization for HTML and for plain text, right? As well as other tips and tricks around like, okay, if you're getting user input, maybe don't stick that directly into a database query, right? We all laugh about the idea of Bobby tables from XKCD, but no one actually wants that to happen for their app, right? Hopefully. So there's lots of different ways that you can do that, but we'll focus on strong parameters here and just kind of do just like a really basic example of parameters, right? So we'll say we have contact parameters that we'll take in, and we might say, okay, what are we going to permit? We know that not all of our fields are required, right? We know that our contact phone number is optional. And so because of that, we'll say, well, we'll permit these different things, and then we'll just do a check. We might say, well, we're looking for a company name, a company city, a company state, a contact name, a contact email, and a contact phone. Yes, what is your question? I'm sorry.
The question is also in the Discord chat, whether you could please increase the font size in your editor. It's a bit hard to read for people.
Sure thing. So
excellent, thank you.
I can definitely increase that. Yeah, I'll just do what I want to do, a snippet. So I can definitely increase that. And if you have a question, I don't have the Discord up in front of me just because that would be splitting my attention a little bit too much. So please just raise your hand and let me know, because otherwise I won't be able to see it. So I put it up to 18. Is that better? Is that good? Is this better? Do I see heads nodding? Okay, perfect. All right.
Looks much better. Thank you very much.
So we'll have our
At least one person in Discord said they need more.
More, okay. So let's see. 18, let's see, 24. How about that? I can certainly.
They're good now.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, and so we have our contact params method written here. And so here, when we go to create it, what we can do is we can say, all right, if we get our params, so all of the necessary data is there, then we will be able to say, all right, we're going to kick off the publisher contact email, and we'll be able to pass our params here. But if not, then what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to just say render new, right? Because you always want to have some kind of fallback just in case somehow the form submission doesn't work. And then normally once we kick off this email, it'll just render create. So we have that. And let's stop and think about what all of our necessary data is. Well, we said that the company name is required, right? We don't really need the city and state. We can kind of just get that from the contact. So we can say, all right, you know, if contact params is there, right? But then we also want to check, okay, well, we want the company name, and then we also want the contact name. So we'll do a check for that. Nope, that is not what I meant to. One tab goes wrong. Okay. Contact name. And then we'll also check for contact params. All right, that's pretty good. That's pretty straightforward. So once we verify that we have all of that, we'll just come over here and we'll just pass all of these particular parameters as well as the phone number if it's there to our publisher contact email. So we'll just pass that. I like to use keyword arguments just to be safe. Phone, even though it's not required, we'll still pass that if necessary. And two people raised their hand, Stefan, and please let me know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Shweta?
So,
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Stefan, that you put your hand
sorry,
down.
I forgot to put the hand down. I apologize.
No problem. Shweta?
Hi, hey, this is Sweta. I was just curious. My instinct was to pass whatever our user passed us and just like instantiate a new object with contact params. So I was curious how you think about that, or why you made the choice to be explicit.
So in general, I find to kind of go back to security reasons that it's typically best to be explicit and to kind of take the approach of like, okay, I'm going to be explicit about what I allow the user to be able to submit in terms of the data and what shape or form that data might look like in order to make sure that only the things that I want to allow to be mutated are mutated, right? And that only those mutations only occur in the way that I expect them to, or I would be comfortable with. I just find that it's just typically better from a security standpoint to take that approach of like, okay, you have to, rather than letting everyone kind of be free and then I maybe parse what should be valid from that it's a bit better to say, okay, well, I'm going to actually require you to, and you in the shape of like the front end and the code to specifically set what the to specifically tell me what it is you're trying to change that conforms to my rules. This actually, and thank you for the question, because it actually feeds really well into another point I wanted to make later, which is that when you're designing forms, whether you're the person who's writing the form like we are now, or if you later are just, maybe like a product manager or a tech lead who's like, hey, we need this form, it is really important to think about what data you actually need versus what data would be nice to have versus what do you not need. To go back to an earlier point, a lot of people get frustrated when they have long forms and they're like, why is this so long? I don't know how long, how much more do I have to fill out? It feels like I keep pressing the next arrow on the survey for forever, right? But if you can have a form that collects the data that you absolutely need and all of the data you absolutely need, hopefully a few other nice to have fields, if you can set that expectation up at the beginning, then you really do your users a huge favor, because over time they're going to realize that with your app, you're not asking them to enter endless amounts of data that you may or may not use or need or even really should have, right? That they can trust that, hey, if I come across this form for Campfire or for Shopify or for whatever, that I really just, this is the bare minimum. And even if it's a longer form, I can trust that, it's whatever the end result of this form submission is, it's going to be worth it, rather than, you just asking me to submit info just because. So it really also helps with establishing that trust with the user about how you're using the data that they enter into your site. So thank you.
Totally, I hear that. Thanks. So just to the contact params method, though, we are specifying what we're accepting, right? So I'm trying to understand what additional safety we get from 9 through 12 of specifying specifically what we're grabbing instead of passing all the permitted params through. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, so this is in the context of the publisher's contact mailer, right? And so if I come over here to the mailers, that is, or just the publisher mailer, I didn't namespace that. That is specifically just how I had this particular mailer set up, was that you had this new contact email that took in these parameters. It is possible that you could just pass all of them, if that was how this particular method was written. That's just not how I chose to write it in this.
Got it. Thanks.
But yeah, it definitely just depends on how that works. So actually, let me correct this, so that it says publisher mailer. But you see that we pass in those particular parameters, and even though we don't necessarily check for the phone number in our check here, we can pass it along, and the mailer here is set to just default to no if it's not there. So we have that, and we'll pass it along. And then when that is done, it will by default render whatever the result of, it will by default render the create template, which here I did have like a fake template that just says, thanks for submitting. But usually, depending on your needs, you'll have it redirect to some page, maybe like, if it's for a model, you might redirect to that particular view of the model. It kind of just really depends. But we can set it up like this with create. We'll do our check on these particular parameters. If they're all there, we kill off the email. If this conditional fails, then we'll say, all right, there's a problem. Let's render the new version again with the form. So now we need to go write our form. With new, we actually have that set up a little bit. So we have our flash messages we have that are set up. We have our kind of intro of why we would want somebody to fill out the form. And then we have our actual form. So with the form, like usual, it's written with the Rails partial. And so what we'll do is we will start out with just a simple helper, the form with helper here. This is where I take a peek at my notes, because of course I am going to copy paste this because it's all there, but then I'm going to walk through each part that we have here. So we start out with our form with helper up here, right? Rails 5.1 introduced this form with helper that is a built-in helper that unifies helpers that were used separately for kind of, I guess, non-database backed forms, as well as forms that are backed by, that have to do with active record models, right? So any type of form you have, you can use form with, and it will cover both instances. In this case, we specify the particular URL that we want to use with the form. In this case, we want to use the context path, and that has already been established via our routes here as the context path with new and create within that particular module. So you can specify the URL just in case that doesn't necessarily match, say, a model. So for example, I believe the Rails guides has a good example with a search form, and using that URL value there to be able to direct it to the right path. Here we have a number of fields and labels here that are divided into two sections. We have company info here, and then we have contact info, and they're divided by this particular, they're divided by this horizontal divider. And then we have sets of labels and text fields. So when we're writing our forms in terms of the HTML, or in this case, the ERB, it is really important to think about not just how it looks visually, but also how the form works in terms of accessibility. Some of you may have heard about how there's an increasing number of lawsuits and discussions about different sites and whether or not they conform to like accessibility requirements and guidelines, and in some cases whether that violates a particular law or set of laws that a country may have with regards to accessibilities for different types of disabilities. But even beyond just wanting to be, compliant with the law, you also just want to make things easy for users. And there are a lot of users that have some type of impairment that can make using the web a little bit more difficult. Some people, they have vision issues, and so they rely on screen readers. Some people have motor impairment issues, right? And so they would benefit from a larger area that they could use to focus or click on when navigating through a page. Having spent time trying to help my own elderly mother navigate the web, there's a lot of pages out there that are not very friendly to people who don't have, perfect vision and perfect, fine motor control and all of those things. And so it is important to really keep in mind how we can make sure that our forms are accessible so that others can use them. There's a great book called Accessibility for Everyone. And in it, the author talks about how, if we're going to talk about accessibility for everyone, then we want to make sure that what we're looking at is improved or competent in terms of visual cues, auditory cues, motor cues, and cognitive cues, right? And so one of the easiest ways to do that, at least in the context of a form, is to have a label. And I know this might sound like I'm belaboring the point, but I have come across lots and lots of forms, both within the Rails, world and without, where there's no labels, or people, they try to use a placeholder as a label, except the placeholder doesn't quite work because it disappears when you start typing, or they have a fancy label that is not attached to the actual text field, right? It looks pretty, but there's nothing to suggest that, oh, this label is attached to this field. And it is one of the easiest kind of basic things that you can do to write a better form. So I would highly encourage all of you to, look at your forms, make sure that, labels are there and they're linked correctly. And even if you hide them in a sense, because you want to have a different element be part of the design or what have you, there are still ways to hide the labels without necessarily without hiding them from something like a screen reader or something like that, right? I won't delve into the specifics of that, but it is kind of one of those easy, I guess you could say, freebie changes that you can make. So we have our labels here, and each one is tied to the particular text field that we're looking at. Right now, all of our inputs are just text fields where we just have a label that says the company name, city, the state, and then below that we have the contact name, email, phone number, and then finally we have a submit button. This is another place where I've seen people kind of get in trouble, is that they try to get a little too fancy with the submit button. Or, I've seen people, they try to add like a back button that's a link, but it's like styled like a button. And again, you really want to make sure that you're writing good semantic HTML that also is able to be picked up by different types of devices or tools that can be used by people who need access, that can be picked up by different devices and tools people might need in order to be able to access different pages and surf the web, essentially. It's just really important to be able to write that semantic HTML. The form with helper does that for you, right? You don't have to necessarily reinvent the wheel. That's why we have the framework that we can fall back on. But it is important to kind of just lean into how it's supposed to be done at the first way, right? And then later, if you find something that needs to be an exception, to then try something different rather than maybe the other way around. I see where people write something really off the wall when, the simple version could have sufficed to begin with. So we have our form here, and I'll press save. And so that actually gives us our form. So I have this container running, and I will pull up localhost so we can see what that looks like. And I know that Jose has a question, and please let me know if I didn't pronounce, I think that's how you pronounce Jose, but feel free to correct me.
It's fine. It's fine. Don't worry. I hate to be that guy, but I think there is a mistake on line 14. I think it's meant to be contact email and not contact name.
Perfect. Thank you.
No problem.
Press save. This is taking its time. go. All right. So I have just that generic page, but I'll come over here to contacts new, and we should be able to see our form. All right, so we have our form. It's pretty ugly. I never promised I was a designer, but it's there, right? We have all of our different fields. We have labels. If I was on a touch device, you know, I'd be able to click the label, or even though I'm not on a touch device, I can click the label, the right input field pops up. And so I could fill it out. So based on what we've done so far with the controller, I know that if I press submit here, since there's nothing there, it should be like, hey, you know, we're gonna re-render the form, right? So let's press submit. Always waiting for localhost. Oh, but it tells me, hey, we've received your company info. So, you know, thank you. And we'll be in touch with you shortly. And you're probably thinking, that doesn't sound right. I mean, you know, shouldn't we have seen the form? Well, let's go back to our controller. So we have our controller here, right? And we're looking for all of these different fields. But really, what we are thinking is that, well, if this is nil, or this is nil, or this is nil, then this should fail, right? But the form isn't going to submit nil for those values. It's going to submit a string. So maybe instead what we should look for is, okay, are these blank? We'll see if those are blank, and if one of those comes up as blank, then we know that is not the case, right? So we don't want it to be blank, so we'll go ahead and negate all of those. I don't know why I started that. Alternately, we could look to see, oh, are all of these present? But I don't know. I kind of just like to say, is it blank instead? That way it's a little bit easier to read. So now if we press submit, then we just get redirected back to the form like we expect, which is good, except of course there's no error message. You know, your user's like, hey, what happened? What's going on? So we can just easily add an error message here, right? That says, all right, well, if one of these is blank, then let's display something in Flash, right? But this is kind of already starting to get heavy, right? I mean, it's like we would have to be like, okay, if contact params, if I can spell that right, if contact params is blank, you know, if the company name's blank, then I'm not writing JavaScript. If that's blank, then, you know, we need to create an error message and add it to Flash, right? Then we would need to do, okay, well, we also need to do the same thing if it's, you know, the contact name or the contact email, right? That's just a lot of work to do. So what can we do when it's not something that's backed by a database, but we kind of still want something that wraps up the errors? Fortunately, we can cheat a little bit with active model, which is what we're going to do here. So here I have a module with a contact class, and we'll just cheat by making this an active model. So I'll talk through each of these different parts, even though I am copying and pasting, not there. Goodness, I lost my spot. Here we go. I'll talk through each of these different parts. So when we talk about publishers and the publisher's contact, and we include active model here, that really is what powers the different, or not even just the validations, but it powers a lot of the kind of built-in functionality that we associate with active record models, right? So really with active record, a lot of that has to do more with the database, right? In terms of what you get from active record itself. And in terms of being able to like query the database, not particularly care what the database is, whether it's Postgres or SQLite or MySQL or SQL Server, if that's the way that your company rolls, right? But active model is really what provides a lot of the functionality around validations and error messages that we'll be able to take advantage of here. So this is kind of just pretty standard Ruby, right? We include active model, and in particular, like the model module. And then we set up our different attributes that we'll want to access, like company name, city, state, the contact name, email, and phone. And in particular, we'll say, all right, we'll validate the names of the company and the contact and the email, and we'll say that their presence is true. Since this is just a basic contact form, there's not really a ton to do besides these, few like presence validations. But with this, we'd have access to all of them, right? So if we wanted to run a validation on the email, for example, and go get that huge like regular expression that people use to validate that it's an actual email address, we would be able to do that. You could create the custom validations, custom error messages, all the things like that. Here, we don't really care so much. So we can just press save. But by doing this, by establishing this object, that makes it a lot easier when we try to manipulate the incoming data in the controller in order to be able to do specific things. And I wanted to point out that you can do this just with active model and not tie it to an actual active record object backed by the database, because there are more than likely a number of objects that you'll need to create along the way that fall into this category, right? Where it's not really something you need to save in the database. It may even just be a object that you kind of temporarily cobble together, right? But being able to kind of have this structure like this to be able to say, all right, even though this isn't something I need to save to the database, I do want to be able to validate certain pieces of data about it when that data comes, when it's submitted via form, is really beneficial, right? And it works well, I think, with, other strategies for being able to operate on a number of objects. So when people use like commands or interactors or service objects, if you decided you wanted to do like value objects, adapters, kind of like that whole list of like, ways that you can expand your Rails app beyond just MVC to account for all of these different scenarios. Being able to add active model as a way to kind of provide a structure for some of those objects really helps a lot. So I would highly encourage you to lean into that. And then when you come to your controllers, it is a lot easier, as we'll be able to see, because now when we have our controller, all we have to do is say something like this. Rather than doing a check for all of these different fields, and then hoping that none of these fields needs to change over time, that you don't have more fields that, you know, come into play, we can just say, all right, well, we have this class, publisher's contact. We'll pass it those contact params to kind of go to Shweta's point earlier. We'll pass that along, all of them, and we'll create this new contact that refers to an instance of that class. Then here, rather than doing all of this, we can just say new contact dot valid. Is it valid? Do those validations pass? Then we'll pass all of these things along. If not, then we'll just render new. And that just simplifies things a lot more, right? Because now it's a lot easier to maintain. Now, if there's any changes to the different fields that you need to make, rather than having to make all of those changes, not just in this particular action, but, you know, maybe in an update action or any number of things, in a more complicated example, you can just make the change here in one place. Now, since we have this active model instance here in the action, we don't have to just limit it to the action, right? We can also take advantage of that here in form with, and you might have seen that earlier. So when you call form with, you can pass the model instance to form with to talk about a actual active record model, right? But that actually isn't limited to just active record models. Anything that includes active model can actually be passed to form with. And what this model parameter does here is when you write form with, there's URL and I want to say scope, not scope. There's one other parameter besides URL. And when you pass model, what Rails will do is it will essentially use metaprogramming to determine what the values of URL and I think path are. I can't remember what that second one is, but it will use model and it'll use metaprogramming to be like, all right, well, if publisher contact is the model, then publisher contact path is probably the URL, and we'll assume that, right? Here we override it because we know specifically we're relating to the contacts path, but you can instead just pass this model and it will do a lot of that guessing for you. So we can do that there, and we have our form, and so we'll be able to do validations based on that. So let's say we go back here to our form. If I press submit, I still expect to get redirected back to this form, right? Because it should be like, hey, there's no values in any of these things. So press submit. Off to my side, there's a hamster and a wheel that powers my internet. And so it's running, running, running. And we get, oh, okay, this is not correct. I think I fat fingered something. Publishers contact.
Send it.
That, I'll resubmit. All right, so it shows back up there, which is good, but we still have to get back to our original goal, right? Which is to tell the user what went wrong. This is where flash messages can come in pretty handy. So here we do the check for valid, right? And we say, hey, if it's not valid, we're going to render new. But what we'll also be able to do is add a number of flash messages that say, all right, you know, here's what's going on. Now here, I use flash.now, and then I'll put that as an error message. And then I just say, we're unable. I say flash.now because when you do a flash message that shows up as part of the next request, but because we're re-rendering here, if you just said like flash.error, that flash message wouldn't be considered part of the current request. And so if we wanted to show up now, right, rather than having to like refresh the page and then refresh it again for the flash error to show up, we'll just do flash.now and we put error, right? So we have that, which is like a simple, we're unable to process your submission. And then here in our actual form, what we can do is we can display our flash message actually, because I want to explain why we have that if statement there. Put that and we'll say, all right, we'll have this contact, whatever the errors is, we'll go through each one, we'll capitalize whatever field is, has the issue, we'll display the message. Now, what's this contact, right? You're like, why are you introducing this instance variable here? Well, that instance variable is going to come from our controller, and rather than saying new contact, we'll just put @contact, right? To say, all right, this is the instance variable that we need. And then when we have that particular error message, rather than we can do the flash.now error, but in addition to that, we'll also be able to access the error messages for the contact, right? So let's show how that would work. So now when I press this, I should expect to see a message at the top that says, hey, we're unable to process the submission, but then I should also expect to see the particular errors in terms of any fields I have an issue with, right? So if I press submit, hamster's running on his wheel. I see, okay, I'm unable to process your submission. And right here, it says company name, can't be blank, contact email can't be blank, contact name can't be blank, right? So let's take a look at that. So by putting the errors here in the form partial, it gets aligned with all of that in the new template underneath all of the other discussions, right? And here's that original flash message where you might want to add some styling. When we write our errors, when we write our error messages, you typically want the errors to be in line with the different fields. That's what research shows as kind of the best way to alert the user to the potential error that they're running into, right? So you say, all right, well, I want each of these errors to align here with the different fields. Does anybody have an idea of how you could make that happen? Just out of, you don't have to tell me like by code, but yes, John.
Just pass the contact instance variable as the model instead of the publisher's contact.
Perfect. So I can do this here. And like you said, Rails should pick up on that and display that. So, well, let me submit. hamster wheels running. And still in a line here at the top. So we can pass the contact as the model and it will have that in the line at the top. Does anybody else have a suggestion for how we can get it to be in line with the different fields, the different errors? Yes, no? Okay, so there's definitely a number of different ways that you can get that to be in line. I'm going to link it in Discord in a while, but there is a way that you can have an initializer set up for the errors to be in line so that when you have your input tags, select tags, and check boxes in a form that it will automatically line them up. And you can do that via an initializer in your app rather than having to write it in CSS. Dane?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that just to add it to the initializer. I think it's I don't remember the name of the helper, but there's a helper that you can just sort of append the div tags and whatnot with the error codes.
Yes, there is a way. So I'm going to, because I don't know it by heart, but there is a div tag that you can append it to, like you said, in the initializer. And so I will put a link to a article that I think is a good resource in Discord that kind of goes over like how that particular initializer works. But with that, you would be able to see that. So let me come over here and config initializers. Where is my form error? That's fine. And we'll just very briefly touch config initializers form. So I'll come over here. You see it here. Like you said, it's initializer. We do it on the HTML and the instance tag. And this will just do a quick check. I don't know, I don't expect anyone to like actually know this. I think I've seen this like be ported from app to app. Usually like someone's like, oh, we should add that. How do we do it in this other app? Let me copy paste. And so that's usually how that gets spread. But if we refresh, we'll just go ahead and resubmit that. And so now if I press submit, it should align them there. So company name, there. So It should be there, right? But there's one thing that we're missing, and that is, of course, styling. And this is where it can get a bit tricky in terms of how we do our forms. So I mentioned earlier that when it comes to security that and also kind of just data integrity, that there's two aspects of data validation, right? There's client-side data validation, and then there's server-side data validation. When you're doing client-side data validation, you can take advantage of the HTML5 validations that are available, right? So you can say something like, all right, this is a text field, and we're going to say, required, right? And what that will do is Rails will turn that into HTML5, and it'll be like, all right, well, this is marked with required. Their data validations API will style that a particular way, right? So you might say, all right, we'll mark this as required. And then if I just go to contacts.new, I expect that HTML in this case will append a little asterisk to the company name input field, right? You get all of that with built-in HTML. And so what Rails 5 will do is, not Rails 5, what Rails form with will do is it will do the meta programming to write that HTML to take advantage of those form validations. Actually, before I get back to that, I did want to note why we initially had that if statement around this contact each block. So that block about the errors works really well when there's a contact, right? But what happens when there's no contact? When I'm just hitting the page for the first time? Well, it fails, right? Because it's like, contact, what contact? You're just asking me to render this form and there's nothing there. In this case, we can cheat a little bit by just doing a if contact, then we'll say do, then we'll do the different errors, but if not, then if there's no contact, we don't need to display any errors, right? Because nothing's happened. And so we can just do that, right? That makes it pretty simple. I know typically you try to avoid doing a ton of logic in your views, but in this case with the form, that's okay. It's just like one little if statement. That'll be all right. It's not so complex. We need to look at something like a presenter object or decorator. So we press new, and like I said, with the HTML5 validations, we would see the asterisk to indicate that that field is required. But using the built-in HTML5 validations, as well as kind of just a lot of the built-in inputs types in browsers can run into a double-edged sword. And while I correct whatever mistype I made, I know a couple of people have their hands raised. So I know you asked a question, Dane. So first I'll let Andrew go, to be fair.
I'm just wondering if you're going to cover custom form builders or not.
No, I actually had not planned to cover custom form builders in detail with an example here. I plan to mention them, but I hadn't planned to go in detail.
Okay.
All right, okay. So Dane, did you no longer have a question, or You had forgotten to put your hand down.
Yeah, I had just forgotten to put my hand down. My bad.
No, no problem. I just want to make sure that, like I said, if any of you have questions, I just want to make sure I get to all of them. As I mentioned, using the built-in input types for browsers as well as the data validations for HTML5 can be a bit of a double-edged sword, because while it is built in, you also usually lose a lot of styling control. So for example, if you're looking at drop downs, or if you want to use like the built-in date pickers, you are kind of at the mercy of how that browser styles it. I'm in Chrome, which tends to, kind of be at the forefront in terms of how they support those different things. But, most of us have to support more browsers than Chrome, right? We also have to support mobile browsers as well at times. And also keep in mind that, not everybody is on a high-end device. Not everyone's on a M1, right? I mean, I'm not, but some people are, but then some people are on, they're going to be on kind of like a low-end, old Samsung phone, right? So you do have to kind of keep that in mind when you're trying to write your forms, which is why I think we also end up with a lot of not great HTML that's written. Now, with the validations, fortunately, you can often use JavaScript and CSS to be able to do those client-side validations, while also styling them in the way that you would like to see, or that is expected based on the rest of your app. So this is taking far too long to do a simple page. I'll stop. Do that. Now it's just complaining. Okay, so it's complaining about required, which I guess is required. True, rather than just a there we go. So we see here, we can press submit. If we press submit, we'll see that we get our validation here where it's like, hey, you got to fill out this field. But like I said, this is it's kind of ugly, right? You lose the styling because that's just how it looks. Since there is the form validation API available, you often can use JavaScript to kind of just run a quick client-side validation as the user's going through the form, in order to be able to style those errors the way that you want them to look. Usually at that point, you probably can just write a typical, you probably just can write like a module or a class, depending on whether you're, doing like ES6 or maybe like an older approach to JavaScript. Some people, for a form like this, I don't think it would necessarily rise to the level of, say, like a stimulus controller, or, however you might want to approach that. It really just kind of depends on how you approach JavaScript in general for your particular app. And in particular, whether you are looking to do kind of like unobtrusive JavaScript style, which is Rails default approach to JavaScript, or if you are looking for something that's a little bit more involved because you have an SPA, whether that's, done using Stimulus or React or Angular, any number of the frameworks that get pumped out in the JavaScript ecosystem once a week, it feels like. So we have all of this here. We have like our data validation, which isn't great, but it's there. But another way that you could kind of display those errors inline is by adjusting the CSS, right? So in particular, when we have our errors, what we could do is for each one of the fields that has an error, we could put a class dot invalid. And what that will do is that invalid class is what this initializer looks for and says, okay, well, that's how I know to do it inline. So let's say, for example, rather than, we'll get rid of the required true, but let's just say we wanted to do this as invalid. So we mark that as invalid. Now, that's not right. Here we go. Now, if I press submit, I need to refresh the page. Now, when we press submit for the company name after this refreshes, what we would expect is we would expect to see that error in line. So we'll press submit. We still see company name can't be blank. That's because the error message is at the top. So we have our invalid class. We have this here. We would set up the fragment using whatever error message we have. So we wouldn't need to set the contact errors up here, but we could just mark them as invalid, most likely through a data attribute or through JavaScript, as noted by using the validations API. Yes, Jane?
Yeah, I think you need to restart the server for the initializer stuff to pick up.
Yes. Yes. I am worried that that will, I don't know how long. Have these different fields. We're marking our class as invalid. One other thing that we can take advantage of with the form is that by passing the contact as the model here in the contacts controller, what we could do is we could kind of, I don't want to say namespace, but that almost is kind of how it it happens, is we could do a require, and then you have like contact, right? That's typically what you'll see if you have a model, an actual model, as opposed to the active model that we have. If you have an actual active record object, then you'll usually see it, again, I don't want to say namespace because that's not really the right thing, but I don't know of a better term. you'll see it underneath that particular model name to kind of be able to say, all right, I expect to see, let's say, for example, if we had like the publishers, we had the publisher model on here, I'd expect to see like a publisher object that's required. And then here are the different fields that are required underneath. Writing your strong params can get a bit messy at times as your form grows in complexity, right? Because there are different ways to account for if you have not just kind of like the simple scalar input fields, right? Which are like, for example, like a text field or a checkbox that's, like, either true or false, a Boolean type field like checkbox or radio buttons, but also if you have something like an array, right? So let's say you wanted to get an array of tags. Well, what you could do is, like in your form, right? You would be able to set up a number of checkboxes, usually using some type of loop, right? So you'd say like, contact.tags.each, and then you would be able to set up your form so that the each of those values was like a value in an array, or in that case you would probably use like an actual hash, right? So tag number 1 is either true or false, tag 2 is true or false, et cetera, et cetera. That can get a little bit complicated when you're doing your strong parameters and trying to say, all right, well, this is what's required and this is what's permitted and hopefully there, and this is the structure. And I've found that typically with your strong parameters, if your structure of that method, if this is getting complicated, your form is probably too complicated. Like this is a pretty good red flag I found, where like if you look at this and you're like, I have no idea what is and isn't required and is permitted and what part goes with what other part, then it's probably time to think about how that form is architected. And that actually goes towards Andrew's question about form builders, in that with Rails, you can construct custom form builders that do just kind of, that adhere to whatever, restrictions or requirements that you want to be able to have your form conform to, right? And usually with those form builders, people will use them to create kind of that custom logic to handle a very complicated section. Sometimes people will use them if you want a dynamic form, in the sense of being able to dynamically add fields. That's usually a combination of like a custom form builder and some JavaScript on the front end to be able to have that, plus minus button to toggle the addition of a new field. As well as I've also seen it in like actual form builder features, because sometimes you do want your app to have a feature that's kind of like SurveyMonkey, right? In the sense that people can like dynamically put together their own forms. And so those come in really handy when you're doing that kind of advanced logic in terms of how you might want to put a form together that responds to user needs, but is a little bit too complicated to try to prescribe using just like a typical strong parameters helper method that we typically tend to stick in the private section. So as I wait for Docker to continue to come back up, we have that option. I know the new method here is blank, just because I also wanted to mention and kind of tease how you might approach client-side data validation in the sense of being able to provide like a hint to your users, right? So let's say, we have our form. We have our form that comes up here, and you submit it to your boss. It tells me it's done, but then it's like not really done. Come on, Docker. You can't tell me it's done and running and then not actually run it. Sure, now when I do this, it'll complain that it's already launching Rails, but either way. Let's say you write your form, right? And your project manager is like, that's great, but we keep having a lot of duplicates where people from the same company, right? Multiple employees from the same company don't know that the other is also submitting this form. And so that we end up like with two contacts at the same company. And we'd like to be able to prevent that, right? And so we want to also kind of filter the company so that if they already exist in our database, we don't include them, right? Okay, that's good. So we might say, all right, well, we have the company name, city, and state, and because in this case, we're assuming they're in the United States. And so we might say, all right, well, we have our publisher's contact here. So what we could do is we could validate that all of these are true. And then we could also add a custom validation underneath it that, just does a query of the publisher's table and says, hey, if this doesn't exist, right? This combination of data for name, city, and state doesn't exist. We could do that, and then that would be pretty simple. We would only have to, we wouldn't have to make any changes here, right? We would only have to make the changes in our actual contact model. And then in our form, we might, update this or any styling that we need to include that says, all right, now it's not just name that's required, the city and state is also required too. We could do that. But what is the pitfall of making that change by adding that validation here in the active model instance? Anybody want to guess? No? Okay, so we could make that change there, but the issue that we run into is that now the user won't know that someone has already entered that info until they press submit, right? Because then once they press submit, they go through that custom data validation, they're gonna be like, oh, well, this already existed. But typically users don't want to have to press submit to find out that there's a problem with their submission, right? You want to know ahead of time before you press submit so that you can just abandon the form if need be, right? So rather than doing that within the, or rather, in addition to doing that data validation there, we could also do a bit of client-side validation, right? So for example, what we could do is we could pass a publisher's instance variable. So we could just say publisher, and we could just pluck, say, the name, the city, and the state, right? And we'll add this to the error path as well. So we could pass that there. And then here in our form, what we could do for this particular field is, let me get rid of the class. We could pass a data attribute, right? So we can use the data attributes API to pass that along. That again fits within the whole unobstructive JavaScript approach that Rails tends to by default. So we just need to prefix it with data, and then we could say like data publishers, right? And then we do data publishers. We can say that this is our publisher's instance variable. And then when we write our JavaScript, we have access to this publisher's value, right? It'll be that instance variable, which in this case is just going to be that array of name, city, and state. And so then when in the JavaScript, what we could do is we could do a quick validation that's like, hey, if we have values for name, for company name, city, and state that match what's already in that list, then we can go ahead and preemptively show an error message to the user before they even submit it. That way, they're not submitting what turns out to be duplicate data. Yes, Andrew, you had a question?
Yeah, so that still only really covers the state of your application up to the point where they loaded the form, right? Because there's still going to be a window between when they loaded the page and they submit the form that someone else in the company could have submitted their form.
Right.
And you'd still get that round trip to the back end validation.
Yes. So while using data attributes in this way can help prevent kind of like maybe simple cases of duplication, you are right in that, yes, there can still end up being kind of like a race condition where two people are submitting a form at roughly the same time. And, one person, before before it's updated for the second user, it's showing as perfectly fine, there's no duplicates here, they press submit. Okay, well now, when it goes, it fails on that validation, and the user's like, well, wait a minute, you didn't tell me anything was wrong, like why are you now complaining? You still can run into that race condition, like you said. There are kind of different ways to handle it. Since Rails does remote forms by default, I haven't seen that race condition happen as often anymore because of that, because it is all remote by default and it is much faster in that sense. There are some strategies I know that people have of kind of doing not like a hot reload of the data, but of being able to kind of like push that data to clients a bit more frequently when those changes occur. So that way it'll be it'll use the most up-to-date data when operating, so that you don't have that race condition. It really kind of just depends on how you want to approach it. For example, I know of a couple of cases where people have used service workers to be able to do something like that, right? So rather than doing rather than doing a data attribute like this, they actually had things set up with local storage and service workers to be able to kind of do that automatic code push, because the data that they were working on just kind of necessitated that in terms of being able to provide that to users so that the client-side data validations had the latest version without so that way you can avoid race conditions. It really just depends on how people want to approach it. But that is probably like the simplest matter, right? Is to have this data attributes where you can pass along the data, and then in JavaScript be able to access that data, do a temporary change in the styling or a display of an error message. You know, maybe it's hidden before and then now you just reveal it, or vice versa, you know, just depending on what you're looking at, in order to provide the user with that client side data validation. That's usually enough for a lot of apps to provide that more immediate user feedback without worrying too much about race conditions. If you get to the point where you're worrying about race conditions, then you probably have a bit more of a sophisticated setup in terms of your forms and your front end to handle something like that. But most apps, you probably just don't really need that. I hope that answers your question. But yes, you would be able to pass this variable to the JavaScript to be able to do that client-side data validation. So that way, again, users can see what potential errors they're making before they actually have to press submit. And I do want to note that while server-side data validation can happen by itself, client-side should never happen by itself, right? Always do data-side validation. If you can do client-side to benefit the user, absolutely, but never rely just on client-side validation. Yeah, always do server-side, do client-side if you can. So with that, did anyone else have any other questions? Yes, no, maybe so. Andrew? Oh, okay, you might have left that out. Okay, well, there are a number of different other avenues that you could explore in terms of how you can write forms that delight your users. So for example, one thing that I intentionally didn't look at was the company state, right? If we're assuming that all of these publishers are in the US, well, there's a finite number of states. We all know what they are, or we could at least look them up online if we need to, right? So you might say to yourself, well, this doesn't really need to be a text field, because then that ends up in a case where maybe we get a duplicate entry because they forgot one of the E's in Tennessee, right? Or one of the S's in Mississippi. So you might say to yourself, well, you know, rather than a text field, maybe this should be a drop down. And there's ways that you can do a drop down field, right? And then have that feed into that from locales if you need translations. You might decide that you want to do like an autocomplete here, right? Where maybe you don't need to do a drop down, but we can just do a quick autocomplete so someone can, you know, put T, and then automatically Texas and Tennessee are the only two options for states that start with a T. You might look into, you know, you might say, well, a contact phone number, well, rather than having this be a text field, we can just make this a input with a number type, right? You could do that, But again, like I mentioned, sometimes when you rely on your browser for the different input types, you do lose styling options. And so that's another thing to consider. You know, you could do that, you know, one battle that you often tend to have when you get phone numbers or dates, or really kind of just any number in general, is to consider how that data is presented in the back end and how it's passed around. In this case, you know, a text field is relatively simple because it's all just being pasted into an email. And, you know, as a person, you typically have a good knack for recognizing an email, or recognizing a phone number and what isn't a valid phone number for your area, right? Like if I see a phone number that's meant to be in the US and I see that, hey, it has, you know, a 3-digit area code followed by a 3-digit number, a dash, and then, you know, a 3-digit number, well, it's missing a number. That's not valid, right? In this case, because it's just being pasted into an email, it's not a big deal. If you had something that was being a bit more automated, or if it was being stored in a database or what have you, then you might have to do some kind of either data massaging or trade-off in terms of like, all right, well, how do I let the user enter this data while also making sure it's formatted in a way that the system can use? And with that, I would urge you to think about how you can make writing the form delightful for a user. I would use that, use that as a metric in general when you're writing your forms, but particularly when you think about how they might enter data. Because it's a lot easier if you can make the input user friendly and then just kind of convert that to the form that you need that data to take on the back end, then to make it correct for the computer in the form, but then it's completely different from what the user would expect, right? And will usually lead to more errors on their end because that's just not what they're anticipating. I remember one form that had a date field. It was a contact form for a company where you were trying to contact them about an order that you had made, and they had a date field and it just said date. And so you would assume that, you know, you would put like the date that you ordered the product, but that would be incorrect. And then when you press submit, it would pop an error message that said, hey, you need to enter your birthday to for the form, because it was connected to like, you know, like purchasing alcohol, right? Like it was completely out of the blue, right? While it might have been useful for their system, it wasn't great for the user. So just keep the user in mind all the time when you're writing front-end code, of course, but really when you're writing your forms. And if you do that and you write forms that, you know, are pleasing for the user to fill out, it tends to be, tends to fall pretty easily on the back end of how you can then take that data and massage it to get what you need, rather than the other way around where you all just end up frustrated. So with that, are there any other questions, comments, moments of rage? No? All right, well, thank you all for joining me. I really do appreciate it. I think the next workshop starts at 2, and some of y'all are probably hungry or need to use the restroom or something, so I will let you go. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is great. Thank
Yep.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.